If you told me 3 months ago that my life would change because of a rusted-out gas station and a stack of old topographic maps, I'd have laughed and handed you a wrench. But here I am, 47 years old, still smelling faintly of diesel and dust, sitting in the back office of what used to be my father's sad excuse for a business, legally richer than anyone in my family ever dreamed of. And the kicker? They still think I'm broke. I never wanted the place. Didn't even cry when the lawyer read the will and said Dad left me the Tonopah property, like it was a blessing. My sister Sandra practically spat when she heard it. She inherited the house, the bank accounts, Mom's jewelry. I got the station, 4 cracked pumps, a sagging roof, and an old ledger that hadn't seen black ink in over a decade. She laughed, told me I was welcome to it, even offered to buy it off me for $1,000. Said I'd probably torch it for insurance anyway. But I remembered the way Dad used to disappear into the crawl space under the office, how he never let me go down there, not even as a kid. I remembered him yelling once when I moved a framed topo map on the wall. Said I had to stay right there. I thought it was just one of his many weird quirks, like eating beans out of the can or refusing to use an ATM. The first twist came the day after the funeral. I was gutting the back room, mostly out of spite, when the corner of that same topographic map peeled off. I reached to pin it back and felt a breeze, a faint draft, like air moving behind the wall. That's when I noticed the screws weren't real, just glued on heads. Behind it was a shallow recess and, inside, a small safe. The kind you only open if you know what you're looking for. Turns out I did. Dad once told me that true value doesn't shine. At the time, I thought he meant character or hard work or whatever parental nonsense he used to mutter between whiskey shots. But no, the man was being literal. Inside that safe was a set of files, geological surveys, lab reports, notes in a shaky handwriting about tailings from an abandoned silver operation nearby, tailings that were later found to contain rare earth metals, molybdenum, neodymium, stuff they use in missile guidance systems and electric car motors, stuff that doesn't just sit around. And there it was, a trust, filed under my name, with transfer instructions, ownership claims, and a business registration quietly started under a shell name 2 years before he died. No one knew, not even Mom, and certainly not Sandra, who by that point had already tried to trick me into signing a joint liquidation agreement she claimed was just standard legal procedure. She thought she was playing checkers. Meanwhile, I was staring at a chessboard Dad left behind, half-finished and full of secrets. I didn't tell anyone at first. Not my girlfriend, not my buddy from high school who still checks in on me every few months, not even the lawyer who handled Dad's estate. I just kept going to that godforsaken station every morning, same as before. Let Sandra think I was suffering, dragging my feet through dust and broken glass. I even let her swing by one day, pretending to check in like she cared. She stood there in her designer boots, grimacing at the oil stains like the smell might stick to her soul. She offered me a check for $5,000 this time. Said I could walk away with dignity. Said she'd even make it look like I broke even in the end. I smiled and told her I'd think about it. That was the moment I knew she was afraid. She thought I was too dumb to hold a grudge, too loyal to dig deeper. But I'd been digging. Dad had left more than just the safe. Buried under a manhole behind the station, the one marked "Do Not Open" in faded paint, I found what he'd really been protecting. A reinforced vault welded into the bedrock, sealed off decades ago, hidden beneath the building itself. Inside were labeled containers, dull and gray, stacked in precise rows. He logged everything: tonnage estimates, purity levels, projected market values going back 15 years. Some of the elements weren't even legally documented during his time. I sat there in the dark with a flashlight and a clipboard, reading my dead father's notes like scripture. He hadn't been a fool. He'd been building something, quietly, meticulously, and for whatever reason, guilt, pride, love in his own twisted way, he left it all to me. Here's the part that gets me. He didn't trust anyone else. Not my sister, not the lawyers, not even my mom. He knew they'd fight over the surface while missing the gold underneath. He knew Sandra would scoff at the station. She never understood why he kept it open after it stopped turning a profit. Thought it was about pride or routine. But he was guarding it, like a dragon with a hoard nobody saw. I found a letter in the vault, sealed in a plastic bag, addressed to me. No sentimental stuff. No apologies. Just a single line. Protect it from them. You're the only one who ever asked the right questions. I read that twice. Then I laughed because all those years I thought I was the outsider. Turns out I was the only one who ever paid attention. It took me a few weeks to even start processing what I had. I'd spend the mornings pretending to fix up the station, washing down cracked windows, replacing bulbs no one cared about, watching tumbleweeds bounce past the pumps like ghosts of some better decade. But every afternoon, I went underground, studying inventory, running basic field tests with the old kits Dad left behind. It wasn't glamorous. I didn't feel rich. I felt like a guy in a dirty jacket who hadn't had a proper haircut since January, sitting on top of a secret empire built in silence. And then Sandra started sniffing around again. I caught her parked across the street one afternoon, pretending to scroll her phone. She claimed she was in the area looking at properties for a boutique interior design office, which was laughable considering she's never worked a real job in her life. A week later, I got a call from one of Dad's old friends, a guy named Pete who used to haul scrap and sometimes play poker in the back office. Pete told me Sandra had approached him, asking if he'd heard anything unusual about the property, maybe something worth digging into. Said she offered him 10 grand for information. Pete told her to shove it and warned me right away. That's when I knew I had to move fast. See, there was more to this than just a stash of rare metals. Dad had structured it all under a trust. My trust, with water rights, land rights, and mineral rights all tied up in a private holding company I didn't even know existed until I found his old fireproof box hidden beneath the office floorboards. I took the documents to a lawyer 2 towns over in Pahrump. Small office, but sharp. The kind of guy who never blinked when I mentioned the numbers involved. He confirmed what I was hoping. Sandra couldn't touch a dime. Not unless I willingly signed over control, which I'd rather eat motor oil than do. The best she could do was contest the will and throw a tantrum. But even if she won that battle, and she wouldn't, the trust would stay intact. Still, she wasn't done. 2 days after I filed my mineral claims officially, someone broke into the station. They didn't take anything, just trashed the back office. Smashed my father's old framed certificates, knocked over a filing cabinet, poured what looked like bleach over the ledgers. It felt like desperation, not theft, like someone trying to erase history. I sat in the wreckage that night, holding a photograph Dad kept pinned above his desk. It was the 2 of us when I was a teenager, covered in grease and grinning after replacing a fuel pump on a '78 Impala. He'd scribbled a note on the back that I'd never noticed before. 4 words, written in faded ink. When they come, smile. And I did. I smiled, because I finally understood what he meant. The morning after break-in, I drove 2 hours east to Ely. Not for vacation. Trust me, nobody vacations in Ely, but to meet with a guy named Luis Melendez. Ex-minin consultant. Used to work for a lithium operation until a corporate merger pushed him out. Now he freelanced. Quiet. Discreet. Knew his way around rare earth valuations and didn't ask stupid questions. I showed him the samples and some of Dad's surveys. The man didn't blink, just studied the notes, nodded once, and said something I'll never forget. This is 8-figure ground, maybe 9, and it's yours if you keep your mouth shut. I didn't sleep that night. Not from excitement, from fear. Because now it was real. Now, there were stakes. And Sandra? She wasn't just jealous anymore. She was dangerous in that gleaming, surgically perfect way. The kind of person who smiles while plotting how to gut you. That week, she filed an emergency motion to contest the will. Claimed I coerced our father. Said I manipulated him in his final months, isolated him, took advantage of his declining mental state. I almost laughed. She hadn't visited him once in the last year of his life. I was the one feeding him soup when his hands shook too much. I was the one cleaning up after the messes he was too proud to admit he made. But logic doesn't matter when someone's trying to rewrite the past. And money? Money makes people rewrite everything. The court date was set for 2 weeks later. Until then, everything was frozen, except the trust, which was ironclad. She couldn't touch it. But the gas station, the surrounding land, the surface assets, all up for grabs and probate, if she convinced a judge. I called a lawyer from Pahrump. He said we'd be fine. Said we had documentation, testimony, years of receipts. Said the judge was conservative, didn't like drama. Still, I wasn't convinced. I knew Sandra. Knew she had a way of twisting truth into sympathy. That's when I made the call to seal the vault. Took me 3 hours and a lot of sweat, but I welded the manhole shut, rerouted the access tunnel, and stashed Dad's remaining ledgers in a lockbox at the Tonopah post office under a name I hadn't used since college. A small precaution with big weight. I didn't just want to win the case. I wanted to make sure that even if I lost everything on paper, the real treasure stayed mine. Because it wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about the fact that for the first time in my life, I held something no one could take from me. I showed up to court in the same shirt I wore to my dad's funeral. Not because I was trying to be sentimental. I just figured it would piss Sandra off. It did. She was already sitting there when I walked in, surrounded by two lawyers in sharp suits she probably couldn't afford without dipping into whatever inheritance she hadn't blown through yet. Her expression was tight, like someone who was used to being the smartest person in the room and didn't like realizing she wasn't anymore. The judge, gray-haired, square-jawed, probably hadn't smiled since 1982, opened with a dry warning about keeping this civil. I kept my mouth shut. Let the suits talk. Sandra's team leaned into the drama, undue influence, mental frailty, coercion. I expected it. What I didn't expect was the envelope she had. She waited until halfway through the hearing to slide it across the table. Said it was a letter Dad had written her in private, just before he passed. Her lawyer claimed it proved he'd wanted her to have equal control, that the gas station was just a placeholder while he sorted out the real estate division. My stomach dropped, because if that letter was real, it could screw everything. If the judge believed it was legitimate, suddenly I wasn't the loyal son. I was the schemer, the thief. The judge opened the envelope, read it in silence, then looked over his glasses and asked where it had been stored. Sandra said she found it tucked in the back of a family photo album after the funeral. Her voice quivered just enough to sound authentic. But I knew something she didn't. Dad never used lined paper. Ever. I don't know why, just one of his quirks. He said the lines were a distraction. Always wrote on blank stock, legal pads, printer sheets, napkins, even the backs of gas receipts, but never ruled paper. And a letter she handed over? College-ruled notebook paper. I stood up, heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my teeth. My lawyer looked startled. I asked the judge for permission to speak and told him that detail. Told him to compare the writing to Dad's known letters, some of which we'd submitted as evidence. There was a pause, a long one. The judge asked for a handwriting expert. Hearing was adjourned. Sandra's face went pale. That night, I went back to the station and just sat there. Didn't even go underground. Just sat on the cracked counter, feet dangling like a teenager waiting for his ride. I thought about how my whole life I'd been the one who stayed quiet, who fixed things, who didn't argue. And now the one time I spoke up, really spoke, it might have saved everything. But I didn't feel victorious. I felt tired. Not just tired, worn down in that permanent way, like rubber that's lost its bounce. I thought about that stupid letter. Not just what it said, but that she forged it. That she knew Dad so little she didn't even realize the paper would betray her. And that somehow hurt more than the money. She hadn't just tried to steal what was mine. She tried to rewrite who he was. The handwriting expert confirmed what I already knew. The letter was a forgery. Different stroke pressure, inconsistent slant. And most damning of all, it didn't match a single known sample from my father's journals, receipts, or even the crude sticky notes he left around the station. The judge didn't mince words. He called it deeply concerning. Sandra's legal team backpedaled so fast you could practically smell the rubber burning. But she didn't apologize. Not once. She just stared straight ahead while the judge dismissed the motion and declared the will valid, the trust untouchable, and the station, all of it, legally mine. That should have been the end. The movie moment. Cue the credits. But real life doesn't work like that. Especially not in Tonopah. The next day, a pickup truck swerved off the road and slammed into the chain-link fence behind the station. Nobody was hurt, but it was clearly intentional. I didn't report it. I just replaced the fence, silently. Then the county inspector showed up, said he got a complaint about environmental violations, tried to casually ask about waste disposal and fuel tank leaks. He left empty-handed, but I could feel the net tightening. That's when I remembered something Dad once told me. Not with words, but in the way he kept records of everything. Receipts going back decades. Carbon copies of tank inspections. Copies of state permits filed in triplicate and tucked into an old ammo box. He knew. He always knew someone would come for it one day. I started organizing everything. Filing. Scanning. Documenting the lineage of every mineral right, every signature, every damn invoice for a bolt or a wrench or a gallon of oil. I turned that forgotten gas station into a fortress of proof. I kept waiting for Sandra to make one last desperate grab. And she did. She showed up in person. Middle of the afternoon, in her luxury SUV, sunglasses big enough to block out shame. She walked in like she owned the place, like the judge's ruling didn't apply to her, and asked to talk. Said she wanted to make things right between us. Said she was ready to forgive and move forward. Forgive. That was rich. I stood there behind the counter, grease under my nails, calluses on my hands, staring at the woman who tried to erase me with a forged letter and a fake smile. I didn't yell. Didn't ask her to leave. I just pointed to the old photo of Dad and me, the one she didn't know about. now hanging behind the counter in a cheap frame. She looked at it, confused. I watched her eyes shift from the teenage version of me to our father, laughing in a way she hadn't seen since we were kids. And I said the only thing that mattered. He knew who I was, even if he never did. She left without a word. Never came back. After Sandra walked out, the silence that followed didn't feel like peace. It felt like aftermath. The kind of stillness that settles in your chest after a storm passes, not because everything's fine, but because there's nothing left to break. I thought winning would feel like vindication, like justice finally showed up with a ledger and checked the right boxes. But it didn't feel like that. It felt like I'd survived a fire only to realize the smoke had settled inside me. And here's the part one didn't expect. I miss my dad. Not just the man he was at the end, tired, stubborn, slipping. I miss the younger version. The one who taught me how to rotate tires and read maps. The one who used to leave me little handwritten notes taped to the fridge, half instructions, half jokes. I hadn't cried when he died. Not really. Just stood at the funeral in that same old shirt, nodding along while people shared sanitized memories, as if the man hadn't been hard, messy, and impossible sometimes. But now, sitting in the office that still smelled like his aftershave and motor oil, I felt the ache hit me in the ribs. There was one last file I hadn't opened, tucked in the very bottom of the ammo box, separate from the others. No label, just an envelope sealed with electrical tape. Inside, a photocopy of a deed I hadn't seen before. It wasn't for the gas station. It wasn't even in Nevada. It was for a 10-acre tract outside Bisbee, Arizona. Registered 28 years ago. In my name. I stared at it for a long time, trying to make sense of the timeline. I was 19 when he bought that land, just starting community college. He never told me, never even mentioned Arizona. There was a sticky note attached, in his jagged block letters. Your escape hatch. Don't use it unless you have to. That was it. No explanation. Just another breadcrumb from a man who never gave straight answers, only trails to follow. And that's when it hit me. He'd been planning for this. All of it. The trust, the buried vault, the sealed records, the land. He'd known Sandra would come for the scraps, and he'd known I'd stick around long enough to look deeper. He'd built a legacy in layers. On the surface, a crumbling station nobody wanted. Underneath, the pieces of something far bigger, a quiet fortune, and the means to disappear with it if I chose to. I sat there, the deed in one hand, and the past crashing down on me like a wave I didn't see coming. I didn't feel lucky. I felt like someone who just realized his whole life had been a test, and the answers were written in grease and gravel and grief. I didn't go to Bisbee. Not yet. I thought about it more than once. I even looked it up on the map, traced the highway with my finger like a kid daydreaming his way out of town. But something kept me anchored here. Maybe it was stubbornness, or guilt, or the plain fact that Tonopah, for all its emptiness and dust, still felt like mine now. I started fixing up the station. Not for customers, nobody pumps their own gas here anymore. Not really, but for myself. Repainted the awning, repaired the busted signage, replaced the glass Dad had covered with cardboard after a windstorm 10 years ago. It was quiet work, honest work, and in some strange way, it calmed me. Some people get therapy. I got WD-40 and rusted bolts. One morning, while clearing out the old back room, I found another surprise. A box wedged behind a shelf, almost invisible, wrapped in a rotted tarp. Inside, cassette tapes, dozens of them, all labeled in Dad's writing, dates, locations, and short phrases like or check, March 1997, and surface activity, avoid. They were field recordings, notes to himself, observations. I borrowed a tape deck from Pete, the guy who used to play poker with Dad, and sat in the office listening for hours. Most of it was technical, barely comprehensible unless you knew mining lingo. But there were moments, unexpected ones, when he slipped. In between mineral content readings, he'd mutter something like, "If I don't make it, the boy will figure it out," or "Don't trust the smiling ones. They always want something." That last one, it hit like a brick, because I knew who he meant. Sandra had always been the charmer, the smiler, the one who knew how to work a room, a crowd, a courtroom. And he knew, even then. It made me angry. Not at him, at how much he held back, how little he shared when he was alive, how I had to dig through metal and mold and grief just to hear what he really thought of me. And yet, hearing his voice again, scratchy, tired, real, it felt like time bending, like I'd been handed one last conversation. In one tape, he paused for a long time before saying, "Sometimes the only thing you can leave your kid is a fight worth having." I sat there in that cracked vinyl chair, the same one I used to fall asleep in after school, and I cried. Quiet, pathetic tears that tasted like old metal and unsaid words. Because he was right. This wasn't just about inheritance or revenge or even survival. It was about finally being seen, even if it took a grave, a vault, and a forged letter to get there. A month after the court case ended, the dust started to settle, at least on the surface. Sandra stopped trying to reach me. No more calls. No more surprise visits. Just silence, like the kind you get when a person finally realizes you're not the pushover they thought you were. But I didn't trust the quiet. It felt too much like the pause between rounds. I still had the deed to that land in Bisbee. Still untouched, still folded in the drawer next to the tapes and trust documents. Every few nights, I'd open it just to make sure it was real, that it hadn't vanished in the same strange way people do when you stop forgiving them. Then, one morning, I got a letter. No return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper. No handwriting, just a typed sentence. If you think this is over, check the zoning application filed last week. That was it. My stomach dropped. I drove straight to the Nye County office. Took a number. Waited in a chair that squeaked every time I shifted. When they called me up, I asked about any new zoning or development applications near my parcel. The clerk clicked around for a bit and then frowned. A week earlier, someone had filed a request to reclassify a strip of land adjacent to the station, the stretch right above the manhole I'd sealed shut. The applicant's name? A holding company out of Phoenix. I knew that trick. My sister didn't like to leave fingerprints. I requested the file and found what I expected, a real estate shell fronted by a man I'd never heard of, connected to a firm Sandra had worked with in the past. They were trying to get mining permits. Right next to my land. Not on it. Not yet. But close enough that they could argue shared mineral rights if the survey boundaries were vague, which conveniently, they were. It was a new tactic. If she couldn't steal what I had outright, she'd try to bleed the edges, undermine the value, make me spend money defending my lines. Death by paperwork. That night, I didn't sleep. I walked the station like a man guarding a fortress. I sat on the roof until morning, watching the headlights disappear down the highway and wondering how many more fights my father had predicted and how many I had left in me. At sunrise, I poured myself a cup of stale coffee, sat back down with the deed to the Arizona land, and realized something that hadn't hit me before. He didn't give me that land as an escape. He gave it to me as a next step. I left Tonopah the next week. Packed light, just a duffel, the deed, and the tapes I couldn't bring myself to leave behind. Locked the station, didn't say goodbye to anyone. Pete would understand. He always did. I didn't leave a note. Just left a photo of Dad and me taped to the inside of the office window. Facing inward, the drive to Bisbee was long, dry, and weirdly quiet. No radio, just the road and the wind clawing at the side mirrors. I thought I'd feel a sense of triumph, like I was claiming the next chapter of something my father had built for me. But all I felt was hollowed out, like I was following the echo of someone who had already written the ending. Bisbee was stranger than I remembered. I'd been there once as a kid, a stop on a family road trip we never finished. Dad said the town was built on copper and rebellion, that it had bones. That stuck with me. Maybe that's why he picked it. The parcel sat just outside town, hidden behind a scrubby ridge, no development in sight. There was a chain across the entrance, a sign so faded you could barely make out the words private claim. No structures, no people, just earth dry waiting. I climbed the hill behind it and looked out over the land. 10 acres. Not much by some standards, but it felt clean, untouched, like whatever had happened in Tonopah couldn't follow me here. Like this was the last place my father had hidden something, not just property, but possibility. And then I saw it. Not obvious. Tucked into the side of the hill, half concealed under rock and erosion. A vent, the kind you only notice if you're looking for it. I hiked down, heart pounding, brushed away the dirt. It was welded shut, like the manhole at the station, but older, more weathered, and scratched into the metal, barely legible, were the words. Start here. That's when I understood the full scope of it. The vault in Tonopah wasn't a prize. It was a test, a map, a loud distraction wrapped in inheritance and grief. But this untouched stretch of desert, this forgotten outpost, was the beginning, the real beginning. I didn't open the vent. Not yet. Just stood there, my hand resting on rusted metal, feeling the sun beat down on the back of my neck like it was daring me to move. There was no rush now, no sister to fend off, no courthouse drama, just me and the silence, thick as oil, stretching out over the land like a secret no one else remembered. I camped there that night, slept in the truck bed under the stars, the deed folded beneath my jacket like a prayer. I didn't dream. Or maybe I did and just forgot. The kind of forgetting that feels less like loss and more like relief. In the morning, I brewed coffee on a single burner stove, sat on the tailgate, and watched the wind carry red dust across the ridge. I realized something then, something I hadn't let myself admit until that moment. I wasn't angry anymore. Not at Sandra, not at Dad, not even at myself. Because for all their betrayal and silence and pain, they gave me something I never thought I'd have, the chance to start over on my own terms. Not with clean hands, not with a hero's heart, but with eyes wide open. I spent so much of my life being the one who stayed quiet, who stayed behind, who made things easier for everyone else. And for what? Approval that never came. A family that saw me as furniture, reliable, invisible, replaceable. But now I had land. I had knowledge. I had proof. And more than anything, I had clarity. I think that's what this was always about. Not just the inheritance, not just the medals or the maps or the mystery, but the slow, painful process of becoming the man my father never told me he believed I could be, only showed me in his own backward way. I don't know what I'll find when I break that VIN open. Maybe nothing, maybe everything, but I'll do it quietly, carefully, because the things that matter most never announce themselves. They wait, and when the time is right, they let you earn them.